the topic for today is finding the power to change. We all understand that change is necessary to mature, to grow, to create newness, and to be a better version of oneself. At the same time, we understand that to change anything, the first thing which I need to do is I need to change. What I can change is myself. And to explore this topic in more detail, we have a wonderful experienced speaker, Brother Neville. So I'd like to invite Neville so that he can share his insights on the topic. Neville, I just put the spotlight on Neville. So Neville Hodgkinson is an author who has been practicing Raj Yoga meditation for over 40 years. He's specialized
nearly 40 years.
For nearly 40 years.
Don't exaggerate.
As you can imagine,
otherwise I should be an angel.
As you can imagine, he's a journalist and he just picks up find the details. So he specialized for much of his career in writing about health and medicine. His books include I Know How to Live, I Know How to Die, which talks about the teachings of Dadi Janki, and The Will to Be Well, the Real Alternative Medicine. He was married for 25 years to Liz Hodgkinson, also an author and journalist, and the couple have 2 sons and 5 her grandchildren. So without any delay, I'll hand it over to Neville. Neville, it's over to you now. And really happy to have you at Upton Park. It's been a long time since you've come and shared your thoughts to the Upton Park family and the contacts. So welcome.
Thank you. It's amazing the way the lockdown and this increased electronic communication between us is bringing us together in many ways, isn't it? That
indeed.
Where long gaps otherwise. I've been living out at Oxford for some years. I'm now living down at a Brahma Kumari's retreat centre at Worthing and doing back on writing after many years helping with the life in Oxford. But yes, I mean, this is a topic quite dear to my heart, actually, because on the one hand, I've seen some really good change in my life, but on the other hand, I know that it is tough and to really make deep change. There's all sorts of bits and pieces of advice out on the internet now, tips and tools for transformation, many things, mindfulness, meditation, self-development courses. There's no end of wisdom, and it's really good, and people improve their lives through these things. But actually there's a kind of jackpot that is possible on the journey of change, of self-change, as Umang was saying, where you can glimpse a real freedom, and it's a different order of magnitude, a different order of change that becomes possible when you connect to that power. And I want to tell you about that, actually. Along the way, I will tell you some of the stepping stones that have helped me across. Not that I'm on the other side yet, but that have helped me along the way. But it's that, honestly, it's that jackpot that I've seen some of the really experienced yogis achieve, and they enter a state of freedom in life, which is very enviable and very helpful to others. And I feel very important for the human family at this time, because there's an awful lot of darkness and much greater light needs to shine in on this. So there have been some big shifts, and in a nutshell, I would say that the biggest shift has been from atheist, materialist, yuppie lifestyle, really very ego-driven and wanting to prove myself in the world, to something really quite different, where it's as if something has opened out inside and I don't have to prove myself in the same way. I'm not completely free, but I really have come a long way. And I had a recent test that showed me that, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. But yeah, in a nutshell, that's the journey that I've been on this nearly 40 years. And I don't like to say more than 40 because, you know, I should really be flying just like a total angel after all this time. But there are many things along the way, like all my family years and my years in the newspaper business, which is a very tough environment. My years at the retreat center, also actually a very tough environment, led by Daddy Yankee, who's very demanding. We reckon we had something like 10,000 guests a year coming through. So it was very, very non-stop and busy. But somehow, through all of this, it's a really big thing that I think if one's life can hold this, and many people don't start off with such a materialistic outlook as me, therefore, if you have held on to some of the some spiritual understanding, you can move much faster. But in my case, a really quite dramatic change. So the essence of it being, I've learned how to connect to a spiritual source that enables me to transcend the pull and the conditioning of the ego. You know, I'm sure you're probably all familiar with the idea of an ego, but sometimes people are not too clear about how it sits within our functioning. The way I understand it is that it's like a sense of identity that we have to build in order to move through life. You need some limited sense of identity, you know, like you're male or female, or you're British or Asian, or you're, you know, this or that belief system, or you're a journalist, you know, a housewife, a mother, a father, a grandpa. All these things, these aspects of identity play a part in enabling you to play your individual role, and they become sort of programmed into your brain. But the problem comes when we have forgotten how to connect at a deeper level. Because when that happens, when we think that the part that we're playing is all that we are, and we forget that we're kind of like actors on a stage, and we just identify so strongly with that one part, then you're setting yourself up for suffering, actually, because everything in the world around you undergoes change, inevitably. Relationships come and go, fortunes come and go, the world comes and goes. So much change even in my lifetime. And if you're holding on to various aspects of this, it really hurts when life says no, destiny says no, you have to move to a new scene here. And if you kind of stay stuck in regretting the loss of something from the past, then you deplete yourself still further, and your life can become one of long suffering. So it's really important to learn the distinction between the limited ego self, not to decry it, not to say, I don't want it. You have to have something of a sense of ego. It's just when it becomes a vice that it is everything to you. And then you're in trouble. And you avoid that as long as you understand that there is the inner being and there is a supreme source of truth. And if you periodically connect to those, then you will not feel that sense of loss when the ego has to change its role, or when people come and people go in your life. That's the nub of the change that has happened for me. This very materialistic, yuppie lifestyle had continued in my life, in my case, for many years. I was right through to my mid to late 30s before it started to feel as if this was really draining me of joy in life. I was working very hard. I was successful externally. I had a very beautiful wife, couple of kids. You know, she was earning well. We had a quite luxurious lifestyle. No inherited money, but both of us kind of trying to prove ourselves and pushing hard in life to get on. And that brought some returns. But as I say, by my mid-30s, I was beginning to feel that I was on a kind of treadmill, and that if I carried on like this, I'd become a candidate for the coronaries that I was writing about as a medical correspondent, which would not have looked very good at all in my newspaper. So anyway, I did actually start to learn from doctors about techniques for relaxation, for reflection, for understanding oneself more deeply, for realizing that thoughts and feelings play a big part in our condition physically and physiologically. So, I saw how stress over a long period of time makes us very vulnerable to ill health. And so those warning signs were there. And also I felt in my home life that there wasn't enough love in our lives, with two very striving parents. And the boys were fine, they were nice, but one day I'd come home from work early and I found them alone in the house fighting, and I thought, this won't do. And these things led up to the feeling that something had to change. And so it was partly the discomfort created by that feeling that there had to be more love in my life, and that this ego-driven existence was exhausting me. It was partly that I had a sort of visionary experience, and then a little while later that led on to meeting the Brahma Kumaris, who were to become my spiritual guides. And I had a set of experiences in those early days that were really extraordinary. Like, I suppose it was just seeing new possibilities, but I felt such bliss, such a vibration of peace and love and joy from practiced yogis. And I loved India. The exoticism and the color and the magic of India was an amazing experience when I first went there. And so I had a kind of love affair, both with the sisters of the Brahma Kumaris and with as instruments for this divine task that the Brahma Kumaris see themselves doing, and with India itself. And all of that was a kind of jump start for a better way forward. And in those, something like 14 years passed where I was practicing the different ways, the different lifestyle recommendations, and the spiritual understanding and study quite regularly, well, very regularly actually, and enthusiastically. And in the home, I saw some immediate improvements where I think our sons, often boys can go through a period where they're very rebellious against their parents. But with me, because I had become quite different in my outlook, I feel that previously, because the boys, when I started this, were 11 and 12, and we'd had a lot of fun together. Because of Liz, my wife, working hard, I'd taken quite a lot of time with the boys, helping out when they were young. So we were very close. But in a way, I was seeing them as like extensions of myself. This attachment in spiritual speak, where it's not real love. It's more like you're fulfilling some need inside yourself. Well, when I started to learn how to nourish myself through spiritual understanding and meditation, this Raj Yoga, meditation for the mind, is how I like to think of it. That started making a difference immediately. So the neediness that I was experiencing was immediately lessened, and I had a lighter attitude with my sons, and they sailed through adolescence, that second half of their childhood, really very beautifully. And they picked up quite a lot that has been useful to them later in their lives and with their own children subsequently. So all of that was very good. And but then I was living as a single. I'd been married for nearly 25 years, and Liz, because our lives were taking somewhat different directions, but also because she wanted to pursue life as a single woman, we separated when the boys had grown up. And I lived as a single man for some years, working very hard in the newspaper world with my spiritual practice in the background. And these were my best years. professionally, I have to say. Whereas previously I'd done well, but I was constantly on the edge of exhaustion. But now I'd got some experience behind me. I knew better how to handle myself in relationships in the office, and all thanks to this gradual shift of sense of identity, so that instead of being upset by setbacks or overinflated ego by, getting a good show in the paper, instead of all of that, a much more even keel. And that was very valuable, and it made me a valuable member of the staff. And I remember when I left, I was recruited to another newspaper after several years at the Sunday Times. The Sunday Times chap was appointed editor of another paper, and he pulled me over to it. And Andrew Neil, the editor of the Sunday Times, was just so sorry to see me go, and I got a wonderful send-off. Whereas when I left the Daily Mail some years previously, having been on the brink of exhaustion, I remember sort of slipping away with my tail between my legs, although I'd performed, but I didn't feel as if I'd been much of a colleague. So big change in that regard, really thanks to opening up this connection to the deeper realm of reality. I hope to be able to make a little bit more clear about that. So this was very practical. Nevertheless, I was, after some years back at that other newspaper, that didn't work out so well, and I went back to the Sunday Times, and I had a few years where I was involved in a very big controversy, which was really unusual, just how intense the criticism of me was during that period. But Andrew Neil totally backed me on this, and the editor, and it was a wonderful experience journalistically, but because the relentlessness of the misunderstandings and criticism, and eventually Andrew was moved by Murdoch to New York, and his successor didn't want me to continue with this work, and so I left. And soon after that, the Global Retreat Centre opened, and I was invited to go and help with the life there. And that was a whole new set of learning, a whole need for further change, because up to that point, I'd always been the master of my own home. We'd had several houses, very nice places, ended up with a really beautiful home in Richmond in West London. And so when I was kind of part of this community, most of whom were very inexperienced when we began, because this was the first retreat centre opened in the world by the Brahma Kumaris. So a lot of learning had to take place, a lot of ego crunching, you could say. But in time, as I gradually realised some of my negative tendencies, all the different aspects in the way ego shows itself, and being in a community that was dedicated to focusing on service, but also focusing on giving ourselves the power to overcome our weaknesses in order to serve better. This was also very helpful. And the big shift came towards the end of that time at the Oxford Retreat Place, where very, very remarkable, actually, that we had the first retreat for residents in about 20 years of service there. Maybe 17 or 18, and years had gone by, and we were so busy we'd never actually had a retreat ourselves. But Sister Manda, the coordinator, organised a space of a few days for us all over one New Year, cancelled the usual people who came at that time, and there was a chance to sort of really go deep inside. And at the end of that, there was one point where we were sitting individually in front of the big image. We call it Shiva. We have an image. We understand in the Brahma Kumari's teachings, there's an understanding of God as an incorporeal being, but one who has a specific part to play through Brahma Baba, the founder of the Spiritual University, giving teachings relevant to these times, a new wisdom for these dangerous times. And at the end of the retreat, each one of us went and sat in front of this image of the incorporeal. And a little pile of papers were put there and a pen, so that if any message came to you, because sometimes, it's strange how in the right frame of mind, you can receive a very powerful message from the divine. And it happened for me. As I sat, a voice came in my head. With me, you can fulfill your longing to love. With me, you can fulfill your longing to love. And it came out of the blue. I hadn't thought I was longing to love. But when I heard this, I felt, well, actually, that's true. That is what I want. I want peace and happiness and love. And I'm not looking for love. I want to be able to, I feel I am a loving person, but that love is not always expressed. And so this idea that if I make that connection with that divine one, I will get the power to really change. And from that time, I feel as if that was the point where my atheism fully finished. And I felt, yes, there is this being that cares for each one of us, but especially for those that are wanting to renew themselves in terms of this kind of truth. And
Neville,
yeah,
just ask, so when you say when you would want to change, so would it be correct to say that when you say the change is to unidentify oneself with all the things which you've been attached to, be it your roles or situations, or so when you say the change, so is it about unidentifying yourself?
The change
All
that
the
I
things which, yeah.
the change that I wanted to happen was a change that would allow me to maintain loving and peaceful feelings. That was the change that I wanted to happen. And the ego crunching that I'd experienced, like various bits of learning where there was still ego, still kind of aspects of culturally inherited arrogance or male, female stuff,
Right.
all of these things. I'd learned a lot at Oxford, and I'd learned a lot through my family years and through my professional life to let go of those identities. But still, these negative tendencies would be there from time to time. It takes a long time to recognize just how driven we are by subconscious assumptions and programs, conditioning. And it's in our brains, actually. This is why the job of self-transformation isn't like going to your auntie's home, as the Indian saying says. It really isn't. It requires a lot of attention on removing the shadows and the clouds and the defenses that the ego has put up around itself that are like self-protective of that artificial self, which is really just a construct of the brain. And it's that you don't want to destroy the ego any more than you want to destroy the body. You need a body, you need something of an ego, in my view. Just as I was saying earlier, that sense of being male and all the rest of it, but not to over-identify with that. You must understand yourself in a deeper way, and you just use your ego identity like an actor playing a role. It's very straightforward, really, but it's not so straightforward to live it, because what has happened to most of us is that we've been on the stage for quite a long time, and we forget that we're actually these souls, or these beings of consciousness that are more than the part. We forget that. We forget that when we die, we don't die, that the consciousness lives on. There are many aspects of this that I've learned about. And that's another side of it that has helped me in the change, the science of consciousness. I've done a lot of work on that in recent years, but there's a whole other topic. So when I had this message, with me, you can fulfill your longing to love. Now, where did that come from? It could have been my higher self. Some might say it was the higher self. It might have been just the subconscious, goodness knows. But my feeling is that it was a message from the divine, and that because it seemed to come, I didn't hear it with my ears, but it was so clear, and it seemed to come out of the blue, and it was so relevant that all I need to do is connect my mind to that non-physical source, which is the understanding I have now of God, that God is like a supreme reference point for all that's highest in the human soul. And the human soul goes through this journey where it starts out, this is the Brahmakumari's teachings, it starts out in a state of perfection, like nature doesn't make things in a horrible, misshapen form. Nature makes things beautiful. But over the eons, we have, over many, many thousands of years, perhaps, depending on how many parts you may have played on the stage of the world, we have lost that original clarity about who we are in terms of being an individuated child of God, a conscious entity that is eternal. And we've over-identified with matter, with the brain, with the body, with the possessions, with our relationships. And all of those things are temporary. And therefore, to the extent that we still hold on to them as our sense of identity, we suffer. So this shift to connecting to God, as I now believe that's probably who was speaking to me, kind of thing, I'll never forget that. And it's with me now. And ever since that time, that's my practice now, that whenever I'm constantly recharging the battery of my well-being. When I'm meditating, I'm remembering that connection so that that charge comes into my sense of who I am, my mindset. And then when I suffer, instead of allowing the suffering to continue, because that is absolutely contraindicated, that is absolutely against everything that you need to do in order to change. Constant suffering weakens you. You must make a decision to stop suffering. You must, because otherwise you cannot regain health. It doesn't matter what you've been through, it's always within your power as a soul. You lose the power if you're identifying with the part that you've played. You think, oh, how could they have done that to me? How could life have treated me so badly? All of those hurts occur and you lose power to change. But when you disidentify from that material side and understand that you are this soul who plays the role on the stage of the world, and you really catch that there is that relationship possible with a supreme being, that connection gives you the strength to see things clearly when you suffer and remove the suffering immediately by getting the lesson and thinking, okay, thank you lesson for coming, teaching me that I still have some vice in me that was causing me to hold on to this or that or the other, and the suffering was coming because of the threatened loss or actual loss. So this is unbelievably transformative for making life an easier journey. So that's anything. Yes. What did you want to come back on that?
No, I've just got a question. You mentioned the word soul, and you also mentioned the conscious mind. So, are you referring to the same? Is it different? That's a question from one of the participants.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah. When I'm referring to the soul, I'm referring to what the scientists refer to as consciousness, but they don't mean it only in terms of being conscious or unconscious. You know, just the same way that, let's say, a newborn baby, it has no self-awareness, but you wouldn't say it doesn't have consciousness. And the scientists are telling us that even when we are unconscious in terms of our brain not maintaining that limited sense of self that I've called the ego or the conscious self, even when that's not functioning, because the brain, because you're near death, for example, you may have heard of the near-death experience when people die
Yes.
clinically and then come back and tell about that experience. They don't experience that's the end of them. They experience themselves in an expanded form. And so the soul is kind of unlimited, but it forms a part of what many great psychologists like Carl Jung and also some great philosophers have said is like a universal consciousness that lies behind the material realm. So this is a fairly technical understanding, but you're asking me more, and I have to explain it in this context.
Sure.
That the material world is like a stage, but the material world, including our brains and bodies, is put in place by mind. Now, whether you call that the mind of I would say it's the mind of nature that does most of that work. There's a kind of informational program behind existence that is putting on this show. In the Brahma Kumaris, they refer to the script of the drama, and they say that it's this intelligence that is actually putting on this show moment by moment. And the scientists are beginning, those that are not wedded to materialism, and there's some very senior people working on this post-materialist science, they call it, or the consciousness-based paradigm.
Right.
They say that consciousness is primary, mind is primary, and the material world is secondary to mind. So this ties in very beautifully with an understanding which resonated with me, but which my intellect couldn't accept for years from the Brahma Kumaris, that I'm a soul. I thought, okay, I'm a soul. I can practice that idea, but what does it really mean? You know, is it just something that pops into my head, or is it produced by the brain? What is it? But this new paradigm, it fits very beautifully to understand that there is this field of consciousness, this universal consciousness that lies behind the material world, and that I am an individuated consciousness within that field of consciousness. So when I enter a body and have a brain, it's as if the brain and body, they don't produce my consciousness, they filter my consciousness. The brain and body record certain thoughts and feelings that I have, which I learn in order to enable me to manage my life. A baby is helpless. It has to learn certain things. It has to learn language. It has to learn not to stick its finger in a candle or in the electricity socket. There are countless things that we have to learn, and the brain records those, but it's the soul that is actually the master, the soul that is doing the programming of the brain. And when we forget this, but think that we are the brain, which actually is the scientific materialistic worldview, which I used to subscribe to, you're really lost, because you've lost control of the reins of your life. When you understand that you're a soul, you are consciousness, and that you have those beautiful qualities of peace and love and joy as intrinsic to the human spirit, then you can understand that is a massive shift that really allows your life to work on a very different basis, far more valuable than a little bit of relaxation here or a little bit of understanding there. This is really transformative, and that's what I wanted to tell you about, because it takes time, but it's so worthwhile.
Thank you. That's quite useful. Thank you so much.
So how are we doing for time? Oh, it was not too bad. So then suddenly a couple of years ago, a little bit more than that now, the retreat center closed for refurbishment, and I found myself living alone in a wooden shack, a very isolated rented shack. It had washing machine and a little hot plates and whatnot to take care of myself. But it was a very different life from being in the retreat center. And during that, I was there for about 20 months. And during that time, I reconnected with my professional work as a writer and journalist. And I actually experienced a lot of happiness. This was like new learning. I'd now got this deep conviction about the reality of the spiritual dimension. And I continued my daily study with other students, with the Brahma Kumaris, who were only about a mile or two away in a house just elsewhere on the Newnham estate. And I saw more of my family and friends because they'd always found the retreat center a bit awesome and didn't particularly enjoy visiting that, although the grandchildren had loved the grounds there. But as a retreat center, it wasn't so good for children. And but in the shack, they loved coming to see Grandpa. And so I saw a lot more of them than I had done for some while. And Liz, who's now my ex-wife, but who came to live in Oxford a few years back because we're still very close, she came to visit often. And people would call in on me, for a cup of coffee. Even they'd included as part of their country walks through the Newnham estate. So it was great fun. I was my own master. I was back in charge of my life in that sense. And that was a good experience. But I did find that I had to pay a price for that it was quite demanding physically, because I'm getting on now, and lugging in logs and being on my knees, making up the fire, surviving a couple of winters. It was getting quite tough, actually. And after about a little over 20 months there, I was offered the chance to move to where I'm speaking from now, at the Worthing Lighthouse. And I spent the past 6 months writing a kind of memoir. It was an incredible opportunity to review my life and this transformation. Not all my childhood and all of that stuff, but the changes that have happened. This shift from, I like sort of Neville the devil to Nev the dev. I don't know. So this shift has happened, and so I was writing about that, and this brought more flushing out of my stories, more realizations. We actually, it's a great opportunity. And so what came at the end of this 6 months, which was a joy to me, I have to say, but and it felt like each day I couldn't wait to get back up to this office that I've got on the roof here, where I'm working away. And 7 days a week I was at it for a few hours every day. And then, the first draft of this book was completed, and I sent it to an agent who had handled a book I'd done previously, and I was full of hopes for it. But he wrote back saying he found it fascinating, but he didn't think it would find a publisher because there's too many. I've been away from the business for a long time, and there are different threads to it. I'm not famous enough really just to have a memoir out just like that. You have to be very well known, and I'm a nobody now. So having it was a long time since I had that big influence in the newspaper world. So this was interesting for me because it was a blow. Even though I've been every day, I've kind of this is also important, whatever your role in life, to be having this feeling that you're surrendering your time to God. I'm still a little embarrassed using that kind of religious language because I used to dislike it so much when people would say one thing but actually do something completely different. So much hypocrisy in religion as I experienced it in my childhood. But now I feel, no, it really makes sense that you mustn't, in order to really have a very good life, you have to align with the way this drama that we're in wants you to move. And there's benevolence behind every scene. And I've really come to see that very clearly. So from a day or two of feeling a little bit depressed that what I thought was something great, that there was no chance of a publisher as it stands. And then that passed, and I sort of, some fresh thoughts came about how to reshape it. And so I'm moving on. Now, my point of telling you this story is that in the past, when I was ego driven, it would have put in 6 months of effort on something, and then find that it wasn't what you thought it was. It would have really devastated me, but it didn't. It's just, I valued the time doing this work. And if now something happens that makes it better, more publishable, so be it. But it's kind of like the Islamic expression, inshallah, God willing. Let me just surrender everything that I'm doing as much as I can. Of course, the ego is there still. You need some sort of focus and drive and all the rest of it. But using it lightly, just deep inside feeling, no, I trust myself. I'm hugely fortunate. I've received so much support and help and such a shift inside. And let me just keep trying to do what I can to contribute. And that becomes possible. That attitude becomes possible when you have learned how to make that inner connection, which we call Raj Yoga, that royal union between you as an individual soul and the Supreme. And when you've got that wisdom inside you, your life really does become so much easier. That's really the nub of what I wanted to share.
Right, okay.
There are one or two things I could say. I mean, just one more thing to add, actually, that I've already touched on this, but one of the big keys is don't allow yourself to suffer. That is the big no-no on a genuine spiritual journey. Yes, learn, don't hide from pain. You know, that's not going to be helpful at all. If you continue to stick your finger in the flame, you're going to damage yourself. Learn, but see the signal that your pain gives you, and then it doesn't turn into long-term suffering, which is like total interference that prevents you from connecting to the Supreme, because the Supreme is ultra positive. It's like a broadcast that comes only on a certain wavelength, and that wavelength is 100% positive. So if you're allowing yourself to be upset, angry, lustful, attached, any of these sort of vices, you can't connect to that power source. So this is where those two things go together. It's very, very interesting. And, finally, I think a sense of humor is hugely helpful, because, in fact, there's a saying that we need two gifts. One is imagination, and the other one is a sense of humor. And you need the imagination to seeing into being what I would like to be, and you need the sense of humor to realize that you're not that yet. So, those are two also very good transformational tools. Anyway,
that's quite funny.
Yeah.
Just wanted to ask you a question. I know you mentioned about being attached. Now, how does one know that you are attached to something? Because we live, we have a job, we have a family, we have a house, etc., etc. But what is the test? How would you know that, let's say, for example, Umang is attached to so-and-so?
It's not always easy to tell until there's some threat to what you're attached to. So I didn't realize the depths of the attachment that I had with Liz, my ex-wife, until she wanted us to separate. And I was very against it, actually. But I got some guidance from one of the senior sisters in London. When that point came, our boys had grown up. We'd been together for a long time. I really didn't like it. I was attached to the idea of being a successful family man, and I was attached to Liz, who she was lovely, and I enjoyed her as a life companion. But here she was saying she wanted our lives to move in some different directions. Well, she felt that they were, and she wanted us to acknowledge that. So I was very resistant, but I I went to, I remember it was the same day she had told me about this, because some people had come along and offered a lot of money for our house, which meant that we could sell it and we could both buy she could have plenty of money to buy a bigger place in London where she could continue to put up our sons as they in their early 20s, and then I could also take a sum that would allow me to have a good place in London. But I was very resistant to this. I'd done a lot of work on I'm sorry, I just saw Natalie's note there. Well, some simple tips of how to connect to the broadcast is a good idea. So I went to the sister in London and I said, Liz wants us to separate. And what should I do? And she said, do you love Liz? I said, yes. She said, well, you'll want what she wants then, won't you? And I didn't have any argument to that, So I thought, well, I'll make the best of it. Perhaps it'll give me a chance to understand God, which I still wasn't really at that time. As you can understand, I had this intense attachment still. You can't sort of really connect to the Supreme while you're really trapped like that. But anyway, so I went back and agreed, and it happened very amicably. It was very good advice because it happened very amicably, and we stayed good friends. And then eventually, as I say, Liz came to live in Oxford. But for a few years, I really suffered. So looking back, I can see clearly that was deep attachment. But I didn't realize it while the object of the attachment was still mine, so to speak.
Right.
So it's this, but these are the signals. It's when say, like, I'd become a bit attached to the work that I've been doing, because even though I was offering every day, I was saying, like, this is not mine. This is just something that I'm doing. This is a part that I'm playing. Even so, then when there was that bombshell from the agent, it took me a day or two. And so, yes, I'm not completely free yet, but it was very, very quick that I overcame that. So there was a bit of attachment there, but it's not too much. But you can tell when the other thing is when you hurt, basically, that that there's attachment. When you hurt, like supposing, here's one for you. Here's a good story. It makes me laugh to remember it. Daddy Janki, some of you may have heard of her. She was the head of the Brahma Kumaris until her death last March in India. But her last few years she spent as overall head of the organization. But for many years she was my main teacher and the teacher of many others in London. She was a great yogi, one of the founding sisters. But she had her own personality, let's put it that way. And there was one program out in Oxford where Oxford Town Hall, and I was the MC. She was in conversation with an architect, a friend of ours, Rod Hackney. And I said to Rod beforehand, look, we've got to try and make this a conversation between the two of you. That's the way it's been billed. Can you just speak briefly, put a little bit on the table, a couple of minutes? He said, yes, he'd do that. But then he spoke for 10 minutes and then Daddy started speaking, and she'd been going on for 20 minutes and the whole conversation was only 50 minutes and there were other parts of the program. So I started to try and intervene to get her to kind of connect with what Rod had said. And ek minute, she said, ek minute. And she carried on, and I tried again, and ek minute. And I tried a third time, and she was annoyed. And she sort of drew herself up, and she was only about 4'10" or something, but she drew herself up, and she said how she hated it when she was a child and the British were in India and the British would talk down to the Indians. And, honestly, I was so hurt. I just was really, she was my teacher. She was important to me. I was trying to do my best in the program. I don't think to this day that there was anything of that present in the way I was trying to rescue the program. But you see, this indicates how things can be in our brains that are no longer relevant, but it touched something, a memory in her brain. For that moment, she wasn't connected to God, which she was brilliant at doing and became better and better at it, until in her final years, she was like permanently connected to God. But at that point, she wasn't. And so this old memory came out and led to her saying this very hurtful thing. So I went back to Oxford. I went to meditate for a while to try and remove this hurt. Didn't happen. And so I went to bed. I slept fitfully. I woke up at 2 a.m. I thought, I'm going to have this out with her, because she'd gone back to London. And so I drove down at 2 a.m. Oh, it must have been about 3 o'clock. I got there for 4 o'clock, and she was conducting an early morning meditation. And I sat in front, sort of glaring, and she was just looking very blissful. And so at the end of it, I went up to her room. I shot out and went up to her room. And so I was there before she came in. And she came in alone, but she understands some English. And I tell her, Daddy, what you said last night was like a dagger in my heart. And now, most people, in response to something like that, they would say one of a number of things. They might say, what do you mean? I don't know what you're talking about. Or I'm awfully sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. It's just something that came out. Or something like this. And they would try and investigate and apologize and all the rest of it. But she didn't say any of that. She just put her hand on her and she said, pull it out. This dagger, pull it out. It was such a lesson for me, because Daddy was a master at not allowing herself to suffer and not allowing others to suffer. What's the point of going over it all? I did pull it out instantly. It was so funny in a way. I pulled that dagger out and it was over. Now, if only we did that with the various hurts that come our way, instantly pull them out, because of recognizing that just some attachment to an image of oneself, like I didn't like my ego was hurt at the accusation that I've been behaving like an arrogant Brit, and so, just learn from that and move on, and see Daddy had her own issue on this. Okay, everyone has got something that causes them to make mistakes. That generous spirit in life is fantastic for allowing you to really, these are the tips that Natalie was asking about. This is central to the tips for remaining connected. Don't let hurt last inside you. Learn from it, but move on, let go. Move through life like that, lightly, and that's the number one way of keeping your connection with that divine source.
Right.
I hope that's a good story, isn't it? I'm
Yes,
amazed. I still remember it very clearly.
it's a nice story. In fact, I think we have a question from a participant. I think your story answers the question. I'll just read the question. How can we empower change when we have allowed ourselves to suffer for a long time, hence the low energy? The suffering was linked to loss of ego and attachments. Past connections to soul consciousness has since diminished. And you mentioned about just get it out.
Yes. It's true, though, that if something if in the past you didn't have the defenses to prevent the dagger from wounding you, from penetrating you, then, the wound can be deep and it's not so easy. I had Daddy's power to help me lift that out, because she was so absolutely forceful about it. Pull it out, it was so took me by surprise. My ego was wanting her to make her squirm or something, but she wasn't going to play that game at all. She wasn't going to allow herself to suffer. And she was telling me, don't allow yourself to suffer either. So that one cleared instantly. It was wonderful. But you're right. Where there has been suffering over a longer period, such as I suffered actually when when my marriage came to an end, I really felt that over a good number of years. And I can only say, really, when there's been a very deep identification like that with another, I had deep attachment. As you know, attachment is a very insidious thing. We think of it as something desirable, but it's like one person's psyche gets intertwined with another's. And when that happens, you both suffer a loss of freedom. It might have been why Liz wanted that break for freedom, to be more her own self, because she's always been a very self-sufficient person. But the neediness on my part was becoming a burden for her, probably. And so it was actually the opposite of what I needed to be in order to have maintained the relationship. If I'd learned quicker to stand on my own, to understand God and take that power inside, then probably the marriage wouldn't have needed to finish. But I didn't learn quickly enough. Very interesting that one of, actually it was Trushar, who was from the Upton Park Centre. I remember him saying that one of the untold stories of the Brahma Kumaris is the number of marriages they've saved, because individuals who are not getting on well because of their attachment or ego, and anger comes and dissatisfaction and all the rest of it. But when they start to learn to practice soul conscious meditation, and if they're lucky enough to make that connection to the Supreme, the energy that comes into you gradually frees you from this neediness, so that instead of being dependent on others and cross when they don't meet your needs, you fulfill your needs in relationship with that one, and then you're more giving, and so you're a nicer person to live with. It's very simple, but it isn't. It looks simple, and it is a simple process, but in my case, as I say, it took time. But I'm very happy that finally, you know, I when I see Liz, I'm really enjoy, because we raised a family together. We met very young, and we were together for a long time. We still see each other from time to time. We collaborate on work projects sometimes, but there isn't that neediness any longer. So I can see her, enjoy her, and kiss the joy as it flies, as William Blake's poem puts it. You know, William Blake, the great 18th century, I think he was, or 17th century English author and artist. He had this lovely rhyme: "He who bends to himself a joy, doth the winged life destroy it." Kind of like you grab a butterfly, you'll destroy it. You know, if you grab a person and try and hold on to them, you can destroy the joy. But the rhyme goes on: "He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise." Isn't that fabulous? Eternity's sunrise, you know, like a permanent golden age, a permanent light in your life, a state of truth instead of the untruth of the world as it's become today. But in today's world, you know, another tip actually, there is so much untruth around us in the media, all the fear around COVID, all the alarmist stuff that is seen. Of course, you know, some sensible precautions have to be taken, but the fear has caused probably much more damage than the virus itself. And these fearful responses, both to things like COVID, but also to so many other things in life, the anger and fear, they all deplete us. So you have to protect yourself against that. And one of the means, it's not good for me to say this in a sense as a media professional, but one of the means of doing that is don't expose yourself to so much of this violent and negative media input that is around us all the time. It's kind of addictive, because it takes you out of yourself and lets you sort of feeds the ego, making it feel, well, everybody is as bad as this. You know, it's like a drug, but it's very, very contraindicated if you want to connect to that power to change.
So do you now watch less of media? Do you read less of media?
Yes, I don't take newspapers any longer. I used to love reading newspapers. I was quite addicted to them. When I worked in them, I had to follow what was happening, but I don't take a newspaper now. When I see one occasionally, I I still tend to read it from end to end. I gobble it up like someone who's been deprived of chocolate for a long time. But no, I deliberately don't. I don't watch television. I don't have a television. There isn't even a license to watch television here at the Lighthouse. And so this is actually, I find, very helpful. But I stay in touch. I look for news headlines and just give myself the bare necessities in order to be able to continue to know what's happening in the world. But I really, that addictive element in learning about news and controversies and scandals, I continually trying to free myself of that. That also helps.
Yes, indeed, very much. So I'm going to give people the access to unmute themselves. So if they want, they can ask the question. In the meantime, we've got a couple of questions on the chat box. How does one stay in close relationships within family, but still not get affected by your own desires or their needs? I'll just repeat the question.
Yeah, okay.
How does one stay in close relationships within family, but still not get affected by your own desires or their needs?
Or their needs. Yes. The key is removing your own desires. And in my experience, really the only lasting, and I'm sort of sorry to keep coming back to this, but I do believe that it is the most powerful thing that you can do is to learn how to understand yourself as a soul and make that connection with God, because that empowers you in ways that remove this neediness that I was speaking of, that I used to suffer from so much. That caused me to suffer at work. I would be up and down a lot because one day I'd be successful, my ego would be inflated, the next it would have a pin in it and I would be down because things didn't work out. And in relationships too, the suffering that I had when I started to feel as if the relationship with Liz was not on such a good footing, and with my kids, big improvement with the kids. Thanks to the meditation practice, brought a whole different energy into the home. But with Liz, it took much longer, but eventually came right. So you can't change other people. This is also one of the things that you have to accept. You cannot make them behave like you want them to behave. But what you can do is set an example. And I do believe that thanks to what I learned from the Brahma Kumaris, in time to be an example of that in the home, I think my sons both benefited a lot. And both of them, instead of pursuing careers, they're both in journalism, but instead of pursuing careers in that sort of ego-driven way, they've both found roles that are more suited to them as individuals, where they can contribute well, but they're not looking to glorify themselves, which I was in that headline hunting, scoop seeking Neville, that was working so hard previously. So yes, it's not that it's not that you're abandoning those that you have responsibility for. You should be staying with them if you can. I mean, in the case of Liz, ultimately we separated, but then I've come closer again. But that was to my regret, and it was because I was a slow learner, I think. But if you learn how to take this power, you can improve relationships so much, because you're not looking to meet your needs through the relationship. And when your needs are being met by this connection with the one, and the love and the joy and the peace that flow through that connection, empowering you and building that into your daily routine to charge that battery, you become more giving with others. And you can, because you're more giving, instead of being annoyed by their weaknesses, you start to see, oh, they're needy, you know, they're upset because they're needy in this circumstance. And so you're better able to see how you might be able to help them with your example. And if it doesn't help, you're not insulted. You don't feel that they've got to obey you or that they've got to respect you. That shift is immensely valuable in helping others to find themselves and find a way through their problems.
Sure. I think I've got a couple of messages there. People have really appreciated your honesty, your openness, and your humor. So thank you so much. I had a question. I think you mentioned at the early part of your talk about that you attended the retreat for the residents, and towards the end, you had this touching from the Supreme, which says, "With me, you can complete your longing for love."
Fulfill your longing for love. Yes.
Fulfill your longing for love. If I can just ask you a little bit more, so since then, how has your relationship with the Supreme developed, or how has has it become stronger and stronger?
Yes, it's a really good, very good question. It's become more and more natural. You know, previously, there was some, obviously I started on this spiritual journey with the Brahma Kumaris because there was some recognition of some beauty in the teachings, and but I didn't really understand. I was uplifted by the positive vibrations of the experienced yogis that I got, and I suppose deep inside there must have been something in me that recognized the truth about being a soul and a child of the Supreme, and sort of this individuated consciousness in that more scientific language. Something in me stirred and recognized there must be something in this, but it didn't fit my intellect. You know, my intellect was really so filled with materialistic scientific outlook that it was like I was two people. And when that kind of touching, that what that did for me, but by this time, after these many years, of course there'd been a shift. The ego was much less demanding. I'd seen big changes in the home even, and in the workplace, and then the lot of learning at the retreat place. But still, I wouldn't have really quite recognized that God actually is not just a kind of omnipresent energy, but God is active at this time, especially. This is a teaching that I've taken on board from the spiritual university, that the world, like it says in the Gita, you know, when irreligiousness and unrighteousness are at their peak, I come. And the Brahma Kumaris believe that something of that sort has been going on since the 1930s, which I would say was a kind of low point for humanity. Between those two terrible world wars, as we called them, there was still the imperial powers had been doing a lot of harm across the world. At one time, perhaps they brought something with them of freshness, but they'd lost any right to be, you know, other than force, to be running the empires that they had at that time. And it was a kind of low point, and people acted out of fear rather than love so much. And I sense that from that time in the mid-30s, when this movement started, many different things across the world started to spring up as if this new energy of God was beginning to come through. And so therefore, I definitely, that voice that came to me makes me feel, it put the stamp on this idea that God is not just, as I say, not just an energy of truth, but a focused energy who has a part to play in renewing the consciousness in the world at this time of great need, and that work is actually going on. And so, you know, that made a huge difference to me. And I don't remember God nearly enough, as nothing like as much as I could do, in the sense that there's 24 hours in the day, and I do spend time in meditation, and I do spend time trying to offer to God the work that I do, to have that spirit, to have that acceptance of the way things unfold. a lot of the wisdom teachings that I've practiced over these years are very useful, but still I've got so much more, there's so much more that I could be doing to be remembering that connection consciously, that God is here, God is an unlimited source of truth, an unlimited source of concern for humanity, love, wisdom, joy. And that when I take my mind to that one, I definitely fill myself more and more with that strength. Now, I've seen yogis who've done this for a lifetime, like Daddy Janki. When they've done it like that, and they've really got, by the end of their life, they've got very close to having no personal desires left whatsoever. They say this of Brahma Baba, the founder, but he was like that too. And when you see examples like this, there's a radiance of spirit about such people. And they, as they move among others, they uplift them automatically, because it's like, you go in front of a really experienced yogi, it's like warming your hands in front of a fire. And that was what kept me going during my early days, when I still was very materialistic in my brain and all the impulses that come from there. One of the things I haven't mentioned is that scientists now know that the brain changes all the time with how we use it. So if you get into the habit of deliberately and consciously choosing not to go down the tracks that your ego or your upbringing or your past might be urging you to, like that negative critical vision of others, or beating up the self about your inadequacies, don't go down those tracks. You can put with your imagination, actually, you can put a big red cross, like paint it in your mind. I do not want to go down those tracks any longer. I want to connect to God and all the truth that God means. And that is also a very powerful means of moving forward.
Right. Okay. And just to, I think that's a related question on that how does the connection fulfill your needs or make you less needy?
Right. It's because it's a heart connection as well as wisdom. So the brain changes as you gradually learn to think and feel in these different ways. The conditioning inside your brain actually starts to be altered from the conditioning that leads you to think, oh, I've a right to be angry in this situation, or I have a right to insist on this with this person, or those sort of negative tendencies that we've been programmed with in our culture, many of us to different degrees. You gradually supplant those negative tendencies with positive ones as you practice. Your brain starts to help the soul to make that shift. So this is also an important. Sorry, what was your question there? I've lost track of what you asked there.
The question was, how does the connection fulfill your needs or make you less needy?
Right. So that's one way whereby the connection changes. It changes your brain. They know now that the brain is neuroplastic. They call it neuroplasticity. It changes with every thought and feeling you have. So this is very valuable. But the other thing is your heart. When you have this love connection with that one, and you really feel that one is extending itself to you, and that your nature is the same as that one originally. It's not that you were ever God, but you come from that one. You are like a child of God. Every human being is like that, and you practice seeing every human being as like that originally. You try and see past the suffering and the weakness, and know that every human being starts out with that purity and love as their original nature, as a human soul. So when you as you hold that vision of yourself and others, so the vibration that the soul is putting through the physical form, the heart, the brain, all of the 75 trillion cells in your body are actually affected by this vibration of truth. And that is what removes your neediness and makes you more like a force field, not force in a violent sense, but it makes like a force field of positivity, so that as negative things come at you, they hit that force field, they'll just fall off. They can't penetrate you. This is what I saw in senior yogis like Daddy Janki. So when I was so angry with her about that incident, it was like just like throwing a pea against a mountain. It had no impact whatsoever. That's the power that happens inside you when you're no longer looking outside for validation of who you are. You're no longer subject to other people's opinions, but it's you and God that's the relationship that is moving you forward. And okay, you make mistakes, but you don't. God is absolutely not the kind of punishing God that I learned about in Christianity. God is this beautiful source of truth and sustenance. And when we, the Eastern traditions have got this much, much more, actually. And this is one of the great gifts that India has given to the world, to restore this understanding of God as a companion who can fill us with this strength that removes that neediness.
Thank you very much, Neville. I think as we approach. Yes, Brother Surendra.
Yes, just a question to Neville by what he has mentioned just now. He don't waste his time in reading newspaper, being a journalist. But then how you keep in touch with what is happening around the world? How much time you spend onto that? Half an hour, 1 hour, or none at all? How do you know that what is happening around the world? If not through the newspaper, then what medium then?
Actually, I'm a little bit addicted to my smartphone. That is the medium that I tend to use. If there's a topic that I want to know more about, then I investigate further. So, but I very rarely see newspapers these days. And actually when the COVID scare was when the coronavirus was spreading from China, and we were seeing these outbreaks, and every hour almost brought a new scare story. There's so many cases there, so many deaths there, and all of this. It reminded me of some of the issues that I've seen in the past when working as a medical correspondent, and how fear actually makes us very vulnerable. It pushes down the immune system in itself and leads to misjudgments and more vulnerability to the virus. And, it's a very damaging emotion. And so I was caught up in it for a little bit because I wanted to respond. And I sent off a few letters, but, I didn't get anywhere with it. And so I dropped it. And that hurt, because my journalistic identity wanted to make a difference on it. But I've got other ways of making a contribution at the moment. And I think this longer term writing, which is directed towards trying to help people to understand more about this whole different outlook on life and this new science that supports this consciousness-based outlook, that's where I want to focus, because I feel that that's much more useful than learning the detail and fighting the fights of these more limited things. Thanks for that question, Surendra Bhai. It is very relevant. I don't function as a journalist like I used to.
But one out of curiosity, because you are basically a science and medical correspondent or the journalist, do you know the developments which is taking politically around the world in various countries?
Not in detail, no, I don't.
Not in detail,
okay. I see the news headlines. I follow what happens in America. I'm interested in, and I see people send me video clips of things that they know that I'll be interested in. So I've kept in touch. I have friends who send me things about India. I've seen some things from the other side of the world, from what's happening in some of the English-speaking countries like Australia and New Zealand. But in general, no, I'm not following day by day politics or news developments. I'm now really focusing on this deep change that I feel that I've been speaking of today, and that I feel the world needs, because it's that deep change that will allow it to provide better solutions and handle better the changes that are coming. Otherwise, we're just going to go into more and more suffering. But if we can detach from these events and see the benefit in the way this drama unfolds, then the benefit will be felt by this generation and all of us that much quicker. That's the standpoint that I have these days. But I'm well past the retirement age for active journalists anyway, but I'm still working very hard because I'm 76. And, that's an age where most people would have left the newspaper business anyway, because it's very demanding. But I love this new paradigm, and I really want to try and help promote that, because there's some very good scientists at the frontiers who are, what they're saying is that the world is mental, and they don't mean it just that it's mad. They mean that it's primarily driven by mind, a mind-like quality in nature, in God, in the soul. They don't know how to describe it, but they say actually mind really is the primary driving force of what unfolds at the material level, even at the other end of the universe. That's the way the new paradigm is going. It's very interesting.
Okay, thank you, Neville, very much. It's been a lovely, fascinating talk. I think you've shared a lot of honesty, shared lots of tips on how to get rid of suffering. Just get it out. I like the story, the one which you shared with Dadi Janki.
Pull it out.
So I think that's quite a useful tip, and it's lovely to hear your tips on connecting to the Supreme, and by the connection, how can you reduce your needs? So it's lovely, very fascinating talks. Lots of messages. They've liked the talk, very inspiring. Thank you so much, Neville. Look forward to your new book. When is that coming?
Well, I don't know. Maybe
very interesting to know very interesting to know Dadi Janki's experience with you. I heard first time.
That was very funny.
Even the book, I Know How to Live and How to Die, is also very, very useful.
Sorry?
The book, I Know How to Live and How to Die, very, very, very practical book, very powerful book.
I really do recommend listeners or viewers to get hold of a copy of that if they'd like to learn more about how to make these changes, because Daddy, that book actually kind of goes right through the Brahma Kumari's understandings, but through the filter of Daddy's life and her personal understanding. And it contains an introduction that is from me about this, touching on this new science, but then it goes right through this whole idea of the movement from new to old and old to new. And it gives a kind of broad perspective that I think is really valuable, especially as a quality in that book too, is that Daddy's bhavna comes through, her good feelings. It's not just an intellectual exercise, it's not just a few bits of guidance. Her love for us, we used to feel it very strongly, and her love would often take the form of a bony finger too, It comes through in that book.
Okay, I think it'd be lovely if you can just take us through a maybe short guided meditation commentary.
Okay, I'll share one or two of the sort of thoughts that might help us connect to that.
Sure, definitely.
Yes. Okay. Yes, I think time's up. From having, when I began this journey, been in a state of a lot of confusion about these understandings, I now see them as incredibly simple. It's really just a question of realizing that we are souls having this human experience. We come from that one, that highest being that never changes. God is like an eternal reference point of everything that is highest and original in us, human souls. God, as I now understand that one, is, yes, loving, peaceful, joyful, but not an omnipresent energy, more like a very pure source, like the mains that I can plug my own consciousness into when my battery has become low. But it's important, once you've learned how to do this, not to let that battery run flat again. When you start the journey, you really need the help of someone to push the car. When the battery is flat, that's where I found it so useful to go into the company of the yogis at the Brahmakumari centers. They got me going. But as time goes on, the aim is to learn how to make that connection yourself. And that's what I feel so fortunate that has happened. I know now I am loving, I am peaceful, I am joyful in my innermost nature. I lose it from time to time, but the more I keep that one with me, that one that is right outside everyday life, that one that is in that dimension right beyond space and time. I've learned how to connect to that, and I only have to be connected to that consciously sometimes for maybe a few minutes even, and the charge that it puts back in me lets me move through circumstances that I might otherwise have found challenging. So I'm not afraid of challenge anymore. When I was exhausted and tired, I sort of withdrew. But now I'm engaged. I'm not active in newspapers, but I'm engaged in the work of trying to promote more understanding of this spiritual dimension. But the most important way of contributing is to renounce sorrow, to learn the wisdom that allows you to maintain the understanding that you and everyone else is a pure and peaceful soul. That is the underlying reality. You've come from that home where you were with that one. There will be a time where we all return there too. But the play continues. This is the time to detach, recharge, and learn how to live again with that lightness of being that is remembered in India as eternity's sunrise as the age of truth, the golden age. It's doable, very simple. Just a question of removing the obstacles we've put in the way. Best wishes, and thanks to the Upton Park Centre for organising this, and thank you to you for being
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For making
Thank you
for coming.
Thank you for coming.